All right. Unlike a review, this is actually going to be your lesson. I thought this would be a good way to teach this content as we go through the concept of how matter is cycled through the ecosystem. So last week we talked about the ecosystem is a combination of the abiotic and the biotic factors. The question was, how do biotic things become abiotic? And then how does abiotic things become biotic? Um, and it's all encapsulated in this concept called the law of conservation of matter, which says that matter cannot be created or destroyed, but it can change from one thing to another. So let's go through it. So on your desk right now, you should have your note sheet. And as you go through this, there are some additional slides I added in, but everything you need to fill in your note sheet can be found on this video. But I'm also going to share the presentation with you on Google Classroom. So if you don't like my voice, feel free to try and learn on your own by reading. So here's the first thing. It's called, what is a biochemical cycle? So right here, you want to pause it and you want to write this as much as you can fit on your sheet. So it says it's the movement of a particular chemical through the biological, which means living, and geological, which means hopefully you started on Earth, okay, and all the parts of the ecosystem. We're going to focus on some of the base elements or compounds that allow life to exist, um, being water, which is sometimes referred to as the hydrologic cycle, hydro meaning Latin for water, the oxygen and carbon cycle, which we're going to separate, but really they're the same thing, and the nitrogen cycle. We're not going to get into the phosphorus cycle in this lesson. So quickly, the water cycle is something you would have gotten in grade 6, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. So here is the notes. Pause it, write it down. Here's the next slide. Pause it, write it down. Okay. Um, but I'm gonna teach it from the diagram. So on your diagram, we're gonna start the water off with being inside a lake or if it was the ocean. And water as the sun is the driving factor in the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. It is what kicks it off. Even though it's a cycle with no real beginning or end, we're going to start somewhere. And as the water heats up, it goes from a liquid, it goes up as a gas. If you look at the word evaporation, you're going to see the word vapor embedded into it. And a vapor means is a formation of a gas from a liquid. Um, but it means a special liquid. The only liquid we refer to as a vapor is water. Okay, so other gases, you have a gas, but water is a vapor. So now we have all this vapor in the air. Well, if enough of this vapor gets in the air, it starts to have a magnetic attraction to each other. Water is what we call a polar molecule, which means it has a positive end and a negative end. And as you know, opposites attract. So these water molecules sort of link up like a chain. And as they link up, they become condensed. The word condensation is when the vapor groups up together or concentrated. So much of them are condensed together, are pushed together, are linking up that they form clouds. Now, if you've ever put a sponge in water, you know a sponge can absorb water until it gets this point we call saturation. The word saturation means full of. Saturation. It means full of. So when these clouds are full, it releases that water, but it doesn't release a vapor anymore. The water has now condensated and has gotten so, the molecules are so big that they actually go from vapor back into a liquid. We call this liquid a precipitation, okay, or commonly rain. Now, there are three main forms of precipitation: rain, snow, and sleet. Um, and that just depends on how the temperature of the atmosphere as what it comes down as. So some of this water will come down as maybe snow, and it will get stored on a mountaintop. Some of it will hit the ground and get absorbed. We call it runoff, and we call it percolation. And some of it will actually run back into the lake. So that's a pretty small part of the cycle. That's the main ones: evaporation, going from a liquid to a vapor; condensation, where it's getting concentrated and it's getting compressed, and then coming down as some form of precipitation. Sometimes the water can go underground. We call the movement of water under the ground percolation, which means it's slowly dripping down. Also, we know plants absorb water, and plants do sweat. Like when you're sweating, that's your body's way of getting cool. Well, plants also sweat, um, but they sweat water. We call that loss of water transpiration. So that's your basic overview of the water cycle. When we get to hydrosphere, we get definitely deeper into it. So feel free to pause the video here, rewind it, play it back, look over it, get your notes filled in. If you didn't understand a word, feel free to Google it. Make sure you get your vocabulary words from this unit down. So if you've been paying attention, here's the question. What is the correct order of the water cycle? Will it be A, B, or C? And hopefully you picked, drum roll please, B. So once again, we're going to start it off with the body of water as it going from a liquid going up, condensing, and then coming back down. In reality, there's really no exact way, but if there was an exact cycle, that's how it would go. We're going to go from your water cycle and move right into your oxygen cycle. So here are your notes. So we talked about it earlier that you have this thing here called photosynthesis, and we said that photosynthesis is a chemical reaction done by producers, and where they make their own food, or they're producing that food that we call glucose or sugar. So please remember, this lesson is an extension of your ecosystem notes, so keep that in mind. Plants release literally billions of tons of oxygen into the air. Now, keeping in mind that for plants, oxygen is a byproduct, or something they make that they don't need. That's why they give it off to the atmosphere. Here are some of the listed things that are so important. You can go over 2 and 3. I'm going to skip to number 4. The word vital here means super important. So when we animals, we plants give off oxygen. We consumers, we breathe in oxygen. Now, a lot of times we say we need oxygen to live, and that's partly correct. What oxygen really does is this thing you call respiration, or the process of respiring. Now, what that is when we animals, we consume that plant matter, or we consume the animal that ate the plant matter. Remember, food chains and ecosystems. And our bodies break that food down, which the process called, hopefully you're shouting out digestion in your head. So as we digest the food, what's going to happen is that the energy locked into it, or the sugar, we absorb, but we also give off as waste products the carbon dioxide and water. So remember how I said oxygen and carbon dioxide are really the same cycle? Well, that's the connection. Photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. We animals, we take in oxygen through respiration, but we breathe carbon dioxide. So they're very well linked. So in your mind, even though for the lesson we're going to separate them, don't separate them in your mind, because you can't have one without the other. So here's another part of it, is that when animals die, some of the bacteria itself needs oxygen to do their job. The decomposers. We spoke about how the early Egyptians were able to mummify their dead, and hundreds, even thousands years later, we're digging these guys up in these sarcophagus and still finding very intact bodies. It's because they wrapped them so tight there was no oxygen. And without any oxygen, the bacteria, whose job it is to decompose biotic things and turn it back into the abiotic, could not exist. So oxygen is a very necessary part for decomposers and allowing that cycle of life, that cycling of matter to change from biotic to abiotic over and over and over again. So here's your diagram. I want you to pay very close attention to a word called phytoplankton. I know some of you think SpongeBob is your science lesson, but please, for all that's holy, do not include SpongeBob as your science lesson. But on SpongeBob, this guy called Plankton, and he always wants a Krabby Patty recipe. But in reality, in the ocean, there are two types of plankton. There's something called phytoplankton, and there's something called zooplankton. We're going to focus on your phytoplankton. Well, phytoplankton are literally what we call the majority of the plants in the ocean. We call them plankton because most of the plants in the ocean don't grow roots. And so they float with the tides. And that's what the word plankton means. It means uh, floating with tides. So I know in SpongeBob he walks, but in real life, plankton sort of goes where they go. A good example of plankton would be like a small jellyfish. It's so small, it just goes with the tide, and that's why sometimes they wash up on shore. Now, 70% or more of our entire planet is water. So if most of our planet is water, it makes sense that there is more plants in the ocean than there is on land, and that's actually true. You may have learned that we get most of the oxygen from plants, like in the rainforest. That's not really correct. Most of the oxygen we breathe comes from the plants from the ocean. So anyway, so these plants in the ocean are doing their job just like the plants on land, and they're doing this thing here called photosynthesis. Okay, and once again, when that's happening, sorry, let me go back. When that's happening, um, most of the oxygen is stored in the oxide minerals. So some of the oxygen is released in the air, some of it is stored under the ocean in the ground, and then some of it is used by animals and plants and bacteria in the ocean. And that is a big part of the oxygen cycle. Um, we're going to move into the carbon cycle next, but once again, feel free to pause, look over your notes, make sure you're filled in. Here's your review. Um, so what term describes the amount of oxygen in a water system? Okay. Um, and I actually just want you to look these things here up. And as you're looking them up, always keep in mind that um, your your whole lesson is gonna sort of focus around this relationship between photosynthesis and carbon dioxide and that cycling of matter within those equations. So we will go over it in class and I'll break it down for you a little deeper than I can on this video. So yes, that's part one.